Okay, welcome back. I hope everybody can hear me. I apologize. I had trouble with um, the camera that I'm usually using, so we're using the little tiny camera on the laptop. So I hope it's not too grainy. Sometimes as the evening goes on, it gets a little bit darker here, and it's hard to see. So I apologize in advance if that happens. Um, so before we get going, are there any questions or comments? We just had a couple more people enter, so I was just welcome everybody, and hopefully everyone's technology is working. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box if there's questions as we go along, and we'll get started. So tonight, I'm going to go back into the text of the Awakening of Faith, and we're going to start looking again at the text. And you can follow along. I'll put the actual text back up on screen, and I think we're on page 44 of the PDF, and it's starting this section 3. We're also adding sometime this week the outline for the Awakening of Faith. Um, and by outline, what I did was just take the chapter headings from the text and made it into a document. So if you'd like to use that to follow along, or as a way to organize notes, or just trying to remember where we are. I know we're taking the text in short pieces, and it's easy to lose sight of kind of where we are in the text, and what we might be talking about, and how it relates to the rest of the information in the Awakening of Faith. So I thought the outline might be helpful. Um, so feel free to utilize that. We'll put it up on the temple's the site, the Google site associated with the class. So, so thank you, Jamie. She already put it up, and then there's the outline. So it's just the chapter and section headings for the class. If I'm jokingly saying if I get a sabbatical, then we'll put it together into a manual or something, and you have all the detail. But I need a summer break off to get it all written up. So we'll see. I'll call the university and see if they'll allow me to have the time. So, share my screen so you can follow along. So we should have the text there. And so the last time we looked into the text, we started with this section, suchness or the meanings of Maha. And actually it's here, starts back on page 43, the essence itself and the attributes of suchness or the meaning of Maha, and Maha meaning great. And we started last time with just this section, and that's where we left off on the text. So we're going to pick up here with section B, the greatness of the attributes of suchness. This part of the text, I think, is quite different from what we've encountered before. So it should be a little bit more approachable. It's still pretty philosophical, but I think it's the kind of philosophical talk that probably some of us engage in, or our thoughts go to from time to time. So we may find it a little bit easier to follow. So I'll read this first section. From the beginning, suchness is its nature, suchness in its nature is fully provided with all excellent qualities. Namely, it is endowed with the light of great wisdom, the qualities of illuminating the entire universe, of true cognition, and mind pure in its self-nature, of eternity, bliss, self, and purity, of refreshing coolness, immutability, and freedom. It is endowed with these excellent qualities which outnumber the sands of the Ganges River, which are not independent of, disjointed from, or different from the essence of suchness, in which are super rational attributes of Buddhahood. Since it is endowed completely with all these and is not lacking anything, it is called the Tathagata Garbha when latent, and also the Dharmakaya of the Tathagata. Um, so first, definition of terms. So the Sanskrit term you see there, Tathagata Garbha, is your Buddha nature. So this is the formal Sanskrit term. And there is another sutra called the Queen Trimala Sutra, which is actually, if you have either the PDF from BDK or the hardcover, it's included with the Vimalakirti Sutra, which we studied last, just prior to this text. And in the Queen Trimala Sutra, uh, the, the basic teaching is laying out this idea of Tathagata Garbha, that we have this potential. And what you'll see here is that potential is latent within all of us. And that was a very sort of revolutionary teaching. It's also one of the Buddhist texts where the protagonist in the drama. So if we were to approach it as literature, the protagonist is female. She's the young woman princess who's going on to become a queen, and her parents send the text to her as a way of benefiting her, and then by extension, the people that she rules over. So they're sharing the Buddhist teaching with her as a way of hoping that her queendom, so to speak, will be peaceful, and the people will have the knowledge and wisdom that they need. So very interesting text, but we'll start with this one. And this should be a bit more refreshing. So we have this language here that is, it's a refreshing description of the ultimate. It's very positive. It is different from what we often encounter in the sutras when the Buddha is lecturing or there's a talk being given and we're following along. Um, and it's a review of this thing we call the enlightened mind. So it describes it in great detail. It says, here are the attributes of the enlightened mind. It's composed of the light of great wisdom. It has the ability to illuminate the entire universe. It gives true cognition, right? So it gives deep and true insight. It gives a mind pure in its own self-nature. And when we're talking about all these different attributes, and you'll see them on the list there, so I'll put that back up so you can see, in case you don't have the text in front of you. If you have this list of attributes here, it's talking about not just the enlightened mind, but nirvana. So this is important from the perspective that we don't often find in Buddhist texts a outline, definition, or description of nirvana. So this was, one of the questions that the Buddha famously didn't answer, and partially that was so that we wouldn't become distracted, or we wouldn't get dragged off into just philosophical debate, wondering, is it really like this? Is it not really like that? Is the state of enlightenment different from this or that, or did someone else describe it differently? So the nature of human beings is we're going to get into these sort of philosophical debates about this kind of thing. And whenever we find a discrepancy, or what we perceive as a discrepancy in the way one person or the other person described it or explained it, then we start debating more. So to avoid that, the Buddha conveniently didn't do the description. So what we have are later Buddhist philosophers looking at the teaching and saying, well, if all these things are true about what the Buddha said and the way he taught and the order in which he gave certain teachings, then this must be the nature of nirvana and the enlightened mind. I think it's important to note that this is an area where, for us as Westerners reading text and translation, it causes a lot of confusion because early Buddhist texts describe nirvana um, as a 90s grunge band. No, they describe nirvana generally as snuffing out or extinguishing. And this was a partially confused translation of um, the Chinese and Pali. So, what was being snuffed out? The assumption was you were snuffing yourself out. But that is an incomplete understanding of the terms used. So, by self, we don't mean, somehow nirvana is a, nihilistic, suicidal philosophy. It means we're getting rid of or putting an end to this mistaken view of self. We have it wrong and we cling to kind of an illusion. And so we're putting it into that. Um, Early translators, right? Who were these early translators and why did they get it wrong? Most often we were looking at British translators, and they often were coming from a purely academic background. And many times, in fact, a lot of these early Buddhist translators were Christian, so they were translating texts, and the point was not to give readers a pure, insight into the Buddhist teaching. It was to draw distinctions between Buddhism and Christianity. So it was very purposeful. So if you've ever done translation work, or even probably more recently, right? If you haven't done translation work, you've probably wanted to buy something online, or you saw something on Facebook or a headline, and you dropped it into Google Translate, and you come back with this very, a rough idea of what an article or headline is talking about. I actually knew someone, and they would follow one of the senseis in Japan, and he had a blog, and they would just copy and paste the blog text into Google Translate, and they would read it literally. And so I'd get these calls saying, "Oh, sensei, why is the other sensei in Japan saying these weird things? Is he really going to light this fire that will be seen from space? What is he talking about?" So it was this very odd Google Translate language that they came back with. So to some degree, a lot of early understandings of what nirvana was comes from this, not too literal of a translation. Then, how does academia work, right? So if you think back to when you were in school, you had to write a paper and you had to cite your sources. So if the source is then available to you, define nirvana a certain way, you cite it to that source, and then other people cite it to you, and so on, so forth, ad infinitum. And we end up with a large body of literature in English and Western languages that misuses or does not have a full understanding of the terms. Um, and so we get to the point where people hear the term nirvana, and I think even if you look it up now, you'll still come across this idea of snuffing out, putting out the light, putting out the candle as an example of what this language meant. And it doesn't give the full connotation. So here in the Awakening of Faith, you see this very positive treatment given to nirvana, which is actually very different from um, what most of us will encounter in reading Buddhism in translation. So um, why? So a question for all of you, and you can either recommend an answer or just contemplate it and then I'll give you what I think. Why do you think most Buddhist texts um, present the teaching in a more negative way? And by negative, I mean talking about what things we should avoid, all the different ways the mind can get us into trouble. Why don't we see language like this, which is very positive, very much talking about something that gives hope, immutability, freedom, refreshing coolness, right? Eternity, bliss. Why don't we see this more often? Ah, yes, this is a good example, right? Human nature is easier to identify or share what's bothersome. I like that. What does anybody else have an idea? Why do we see this less often? Monasticism, yes. Translator's bias. Everybody's awake tonight. This is great. Um, let's see. Cultural preference for emphasizing positive versus negative. So everybody's on the right trail, right? Everybody's on the right track. So think back to the Buddhist time and what's different right away from all of us versus sitting at the Buddha's feet. Well, one, I'm sitting inside a building right now, um, and despite its great age, she's an old gal here at our temple, um, but she does a phenomenal job of keeping the rain off of the inside of the temple. Um, Most of the Buddha's lectures were outside. Most of the people listening, not all, but most often when you're reading the sutras, you're coming across a group of monks and nuns, and they're very diligently going about the business of getting awakened. And I think the Buddha didn't want to mince words or waste their time, so he was like, "Come on, get with it. Like this is the work we're undertaking." And there was a sense of urgency. Um, there's also the perspective that if we, you know, anyone who's teaching, if you point to what is not seen, right? If you point out what isn't evident, and what isn't evident is all the ways the mind goes astray, then people start to gain deeper insight into the nature and function of the mind. So it sometimes comes away from being a little bit sounding negative, right? These are the different ways you might go. So if you think about, you go to the temple, you engage in the service, you recite the 10 vows, and all of them are avoiding things that are, we could say are negative. Don't steal, don't lie, don't speak abusively, avoid misconduct of various natures, right? These are things to avoid. It could be written, magnify your um, appreciation of others, right? It could be share merits widely, right? So why don't we write it that way? Traditionally, it's because we sometimes need to be reminded of not to be naughty, and we need to reflect generally when things that we don't um, think of as being harmful to others may be harmful, because most of our work is corrective. Um, for example, you go to the doctor. Um, when's the last time you were at the doctor's office and you got a massage and stretching and a spa treatment? Probably never, right? But those things are beneficial. But the doctor is looking at what is immediately at the surface that needs to be addressed. Um, so you're going to get medication. You probably won't get vitamins, even though it's probably beneficial to take vitamins. You probably won't get vitamins unless you have a deficiency, right? Unless it's gone so far in the other direction. I think the Buddha was, and all of his disciples teaching at that time were seeing significant deficiencies and saying, wow, you're really low in iron. And so us as students go, well, yeah, but I have a little, my shoulder hurts a little bit too. What, can I get something for that? But we're looking at the wrong thing. Um, but you fast forward hundreds of years to when the Awakening of Faith is being written, and now there are misconceptions about the teaching. So we've gone through a couple different languages already by this point. We've gone through different Buddhist countries, and by countries, kingdoms may only be as big as a valley. So you go from region to region, city to city. People have different customs and understandings of things, and so you come to the awakening of faith, and it's necessary to remind people not to misconstrue the teaching or to take all of these ideas as negative. They were prescriptive. They were very much prescriptive. So if you read, a medical text, a medical textbook, everything's going wrong in the textbook. Um, I actually I worked with one of the medical licensing boards, and it came up at a board meeting. What if you have a patient who has you know no dysfunction, no illness, and they're perfectly healthy? What do you put down in your notes? And all the doctors, were scratching their heads, wondering, like, well, what do we write down? You have to chart something. You have to write down something. What do you write down? And I believe one of the doctors said, well, you write down, otherwise normal etiology right there. Everything is fine. There is a way to chart that. But it was fascinating in a realm where most everyone coming to them is sick. When they didn't approach sickness, everyone was, what? How do you write that down? Um, and I of course I laughed at how I shouldn't have. Everybody was very serious, like, oh, I thought it was the funniest thing. Um, so for many, you know, one of the attributes of the Buddha is, the great physician. So he's seeing people seeking, and in their seeking, oftentimes the questions they're asking are ill-formed. The assumptions they have when they come to ask the Buddha a question are wrong. Um, their practice is, needs adjustment. So he's addressing that need. So we see that. But 2,600 years later, and in a multicultural community with multiple religions and everything, um, we read lists of uh, symptoms, and we go, "Gosh, man, this is pretty negative." So our perspective is different. So for that reason, the language needs to change. Um, oh, sorry, I've been sharing the screen all the time, talking to you. Um, so for that reason, the language needs to change. So the these lists, this is an example where the language changes and becomes very positive. Um, why don't we see this more? It's easy for us to get distracted by the beauty. We can get caught up in the beauty, the floweriness of the language, and forget to practice. We can have a perspective of like everything's beautiful and it's great, and you get lost in the light, this kind of perspective, and then we forget to do the real spiritual work. So the awakening of faith has both perspectives. It tells us that the thing you're striving for is, beautiful. It's light. It's filled with wisdom. It all of these wonderful descriptions, but it doesn't want us to forget how do we actually get there. So I imagine, it's probably like we're all in the car headed, on vacation, and we're all the kids in the back seat going, "How much longer, Dad?" And well, don't worry, when we get there, there's going to be a pool, and you're going to have fun, and there'll be candy. We're like, okay, and we try to make it. Um, but in the meantime, we're still going, how much longer? Um, Maybe kids don't ask that anymore. They all have like video screens in the car. Not when I was a kid. Hopefully you packed enough books and coloring books or whatever that were going to keep you occupied for the road trip. But now I drive down the highway, I see everybody has a screen. All the kids are watching. So, oh, they still say it. Okay, how much longer? Are we almost there yet? So that's all of us, right? We're all in the car asking, are we almost there yet? Does that mean that all Buddhist texts are dry and boring and don't have, beautiful imagery? No, not at all. In fact, you'll find the most um, flowery, beautiful, sumptuous language in the sutras, talking about the heavens, talking about heavenly beings, um, talking about angelic figures when they are in the presence of the Buddha, the music that's offered by the heavenly beings to the Buddha. Um, I would be willing to wager that you would get tired of reading the language because it goes on and it's so descriptive. The descriptions of the Pure Land are almost impossibly detailed, and it's truly impressive just reading the level of detail. The beauty is there, but we can't forget to do the practice. Um, yeah, you're absolutely right. So one of the comments is the Avatamsaka is a trip. It is definitely a trip. In fact, if you read the larger Pure Land Sutra of Amida's Pure Land, that is also amazingly detailed in language. So, um, but even as beautiful and adorned as the temple is, we want to avoid too much daydreaming, right? We can get lost in that. So we have to have a healthy balance between the two. So this is where this language comes in. I want to highlight it because this is our respite in a way from long pages of lists and all the ways in which the mind sometimes goes astray. So for that purpose, this section is quite refreshing. So I apologize I left you on screen sharing all that time. So but we'll go back. We'll go down a little bit. So here's a question following that. It was explained before that the essence of suchness is undifferentiated and devoid of all characteristics. Why is it, then, that you have described its essence and having these various excellent qualities? And then answer, though it has, in reality, all these excellent qualities, it does not have any characteristics of differentiation. It retains its identity and is of one flavor. Suchness is solely one. So now we're back to the cryptic philosophical language. So I'll try to clarify, and I'll remember to come back to the video this time. What does this mean? The question is asking, how can something be many things and one thing simultaneously? Right? How can you say this enlightened mind, this ultimate nirvana, is all of these things, but is actually undifferentiated and is the one mind? Right? This seems contradictory. So here's an example of how is one thing many things? There you go. You have one thing, light, but when passed through a prism, right, with the correct understanding, you realize it's many things. It's infinite colors, infinite variation in tone and shade and all the things that light is. So this is one of the reasons I think you'll see so much light imagery in Shingon, especially Buddhism generally. The metaphor of light can really help us understand the idea more clearly and why it's important in Buddhist philosophical thinking. But the next question may be with your best California surfer, huh? But explain it to me more, right? So the text does go on. So I'll put the text back up. What does this mean? Right? This is the next question. What does it really mean? And the answer is Since it is devoid of individuation, it is free from the characteristics of individuation. Thus, it is one without any second. So these are terms that we use all the time in our day-to-day speech, but I'll keep reading. What more does this mean? Then how can you speak of differentiation, the plurality of the characteristics of suchness? Answer. In contrast to the characteristics of the phenomena of the activating mind, the characteristics of suchness can be inferred. What? Okay. So the text has told us two things that seem contradictory: that the enlightened mind is one thing, and at the same time, it encompasses all things. That the enlightened mind is always there, but at the same time, we still manifest our current state where we don't see it clearly. So, this part of the text is trying to help us pull apart and dissect what seems to be a contradictory teaching. And if we are having trouble conceptualizing it, even during the time when the Awakening of Faith was written, there was difficulty conceptualizing it. If we are having trouble, um, putting our finger on it and saying, "Oh, I have a really firm understanding of this," then it's also true. You can see this from Asvaghosa's standpoint by writing the Awakening of Faith, that philosophers of his time were having trouble making sense of it. So we shouldn't feel bad um, in our understanding. So to explain this a little bit more, I'm going to utilize what comes next with this, the translator's note. If we read that one together, this may help. So the translation of the last sentence follows in the main the interpretation of Fazan. Literally, we show it, depending on the characteristics of birth and death of the activating mind. This means that though in the ultimate sense, suchness defies any predication of its characteristics, the characteristics of suchness can be symbolically suggested in relative terms that are accessible to the deluded mind and are imagined to be the exact opposites of the characteristics of phenomena of the activating mind. Okay. The part here that I want you to key in on is this symbolically suggested. And this symbolically suggested is I will represent to you one of the reasons why this text is important in Shingon. Okay, so keep this symbolically suggested part in mind, and I'll try to make this a little bit clear. So the big question is, how is one thing all things? How is something not differentiated yet differentiated? So these seem contradictory. So the basic idea, right, is enlightenment. The enlightened mind is equal for all Buddhas. So all Buddhas, everyone who attains enlightenment, is equally enlightened. Their enlightenment is the same, right? So to that degree, it is undifferentiated. The Buddha nature that is inside of us contains that seed that has all the ingredients for your awakening. It has everything is there. And it has all the realizations that come as a result of awakening. Awakening, however, triggers a whole set of awarenesses of how things are and how you lead beings. So if you attain enlightenment at this moment, your enlightenment is the same as the Buddha's enlightenment. The way you will have insight into people's suffering will be different because people suffer slightly different ways than they suffered during the time of the Buddha. So you can make a pretty clear connection between chariots and cars, but maybe not as clear a connection between letters and tweets or social media harassment and gossip in the village. They're roughly the same, but they operate somewhat differently. So you will have insight into these different needs of people, and that's what the basis of your teaching would be, right? How to alleviate and address the current needs of people. But the underlying enlightenment would be the same. So you have this non-differentiated and differentiated at the same time. Um, this awakening that comes as a result of enlightenment is not necessarily an instant download of all this knowledge. You have this deep awareness, right? So the Buddha has this deep awareness that comes as a result of enlightenment. And as he looks around at circumstance, as he looks back on his own experience, and as people come to him with questions, he's able to enunciate the teaching. So were a Buddha to, walk in and sit down on a TV set and start answering people's questions today, the answers will come from the same source, but they're going to be uniquely tailored to the needs of the people at the moment. So um, I think this also helps us understand what you're enlightened to. So the Buddha's enlightenment, if you look at everything he taught, he didn't become a structural engineer suddenly through enlightenment. That's not to say that you wouldn't have that knowledge, but again, it's tailor made for the needs of enlightening others. Um, he's not spending a lot of time discussing the structure of the atom, although that was discussed. Um, the purpose is to answer people's questions that are obstacles for them in their thinking. Um, so you're removing what obscures so that you reveal a new dimension. So this is the function. So while the enlightenment is equal, how it manifests in relation to people's needs is different. So here, the awakening of faith is telling us we have these differentiated yet not differentiated. So the enlightenment is the same. The manifestation in regards or response to people would be different. I'll put this back up so we don't forget this term. So we have this term mentioned here, symbolically suggested. So the characteristics of suchness can be symbolically suggested. So I ask you to remember that. So here's where we get a little bit closer to why the text is so important in Shingon. So we often refer to Shingon or Shingon Mikyo, right? This mysterious quality that is part of Tantra esoteric practice, what Shingon does. And the idea is that the esoteric is actually hiding in plain sight. If we know how to see it, it will be evident to us. If we've developed sensitivity to seeing it, we will see it everywhere. If we don't have that sensitivity, we're sort of blind to that aspect of the teaching. And in Kukai's writings, he says this is true for the sutras. It's also true for other religious teaching. That you'll see truth in other religious teaching if you're looking at the teaching with the right lens, right, with the right eyes, maybe with the right glasses. During Kukai's time, he was challenged. Right, he comes back from China with a new teaching, and people challenge him. Where are you getting this esoteric Buddhism from? Right? How is it any different from our current Buddhism? And show us where this Buddhism comes from. How can you possibly attain enlightenment in this very lifetime? Where does it say that in the sutras? Right? Our common understanding is it's going to take infinite lifetimes. You can't do it that quickly. Where are you getting this from? And his whole premise in the 10 stages of mind, or the 10 abodes of mind, the Juju Shinron, his sort of the largest book that he wrote, is that all teachings can point the practitioner toward the esoteric, and the esoteric is present in all of them. So he goes about pointing towards Taoism, Confucianism, all the various different modes and means of practice within all the different Buddhist schools, and says, if you read the text right, you'll see what I'm talking about. There's more that's revealed there if you read it the right way. There's more of the Buddha's actual experience present. There's what the Buddha was actually enlightened to is present there rather than his responses to questions. If you're just reading it on the surface, if you read more deeply, we would say, if you read between the lines, you'll see how it is that he's arriving at these answers or at that teaching. That there, you can get a sense of the lived experience of enlightenment, and that's what makes the teaching esoteric. That there is this esoteric component in all of the teachings. And the esoteric here means not something secret, but that you can get a glimpse of the actual function, or there's a potential for the enlightened mind to reveal itself directly through a text or through symbols, right? So symbolically designated, you might be able to glimpse it through the mandala, through art, and that where language ends, right, where language stops being able to express an idea to us, art forms can. So music and poetry can touch us in ways that spoken word cannot. Paintings, photography, video, all of these things can, sculpture can evoke in us emotions that other mediums don't. Think about it. When's the last time you went to someone's home and they had a sheet of paper? This is my favorite page of a book, so I hung it on a wall. Right? That's not the way we interact or are touched by the written word. We hang pictures. We don't actually, even though it's possible, I don't think many people have their favorite movie on loop on a television hanging on the wall because they loved it so much. It's not the way we interact with that medium. But sculpture, painting, photography, someone's favorite picture, they will, and they'll take inspiration from it over time. It's communicating something deeper that we don't get from the written word. So this is part of what Kukai says is the esoteric speaking through the exoteric. I sometimes like to give comparisons between John Muir and Kukai because both, in many ways, were naturalists and saw something deeper in the natural world than the average person. So this quote is from John Muir. "The sun shines not on us, but in us. The rivers flow not past, but through us. Thrilling, tingling, vibrating every fiber and cell of the substance of our bodies, making them glide and sing. The trees wave and the flowers bloom in their bodies as well as in our souls. And every bird song, wind song, and tremendous storm song of the rocks in the heart of the mountains is our song, our very own, and sings our love." So I think Muir was seeing something in the natural world that was there, but not immediately evident. But when you read his words, you get a sense of his experience. You get a sense of his experience that's not the same as, someone just inviting you on a hike. There's something that's coming through as a deeper explanation. So I'll read you also, if you happen to have the major works of Kukai, this is from that text. "The doctrine revealed by the Nirmanakaya Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, is called exoteric. It is apparent, simplified, and adapted to the needs of the time and to the capacity of the listeners. The doctrine expounded by the Dharmakaya Buddha, Mahavajracana, is called esoteric. It is secret and profound and contains the final truth." So in that statement, Um, Kukai is drawing a distinction between the direct teaching, this is what to do, this is what to avoid, and the direct experience that we might have that comes from practice, right? Which we might say is a feeling, or we get a sense of the teaching, or we have a dramatic um, experience of our own, something that really speaks to us. And that is oftentimes beyond beyond words, and that's where we need symbolic representations. We have art. Um, you can read the sutra and get to a certain point. You may look at a sculpture of one of the Buddhas or Bodhisattvas and have that teaching that you read understood differently because it's communicated through artistic representation, and it could communicate to you something much deeper than you would see in the written word. So this is these different levels of differentiation that the awakening of faith is talking about. There's another aspect to this section. I'll put the text back up. And the question comes from um, this whole, right, in contrast to the characteristics of phenomena, the activating mind and characteristics of suchness can be inferred. Remember the name of the text was the awakening of faith. And we can take a minute to think about what is meant by awakening. From our own current perspective, from your current perspective, what is the text asking you to do? What is the first state of awakening? And here is asking you to awaken to the spiritual life, which is very simple, actually. It's asking you to see things as they truly are, to understand or feel the contrast between what is and what should be. If you see your own mind, and you see the chaos that's in our thinking, how unstable our mind can be, the difficulty that we have when we try to meditate, the difficulty we often have, we try to focus on things. And you see this mind running wild. And you contrast that with the Buddhist explanation of what the mind could be, of what the mind originally is, that there's this expression of peace and solitude, happiness that comes from simplicity and understanding that we should have enough rather than chasing more. Right? So if you contrast these two states, then awakening comes from us looking into the teaching and awakening to a different reality, saying, wait, I'm not satisfied with the current state of things. I really want what's described in the text. This is an awakening. So our first step in awakening is just contrasting those two things. And it's a state we find ourselves in that may not feel like a miraculous change. We are being asked to awaken to a different reality, to a reality that is not chasing things that we think will make us happy but probably won't. A reality where there's not a loud train. Oh, good, it's a short one tonight. Oh, that's different. Okay. It's asking us to awaken to seeing that a lot of the things that we amass in life spoke too soon. A lot of things that we amass in life are weighing us down. That probably won't make us happy. Asking us to see that pressure that thank you. Is that better? Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Sorry, the train was so loud it changed the. Sorry, the train finished passing now. So, if you haven't been here, we are steps away from a major train crossing, and this time of evening, they they usually go through, and it's you can really feel it. You can really feel it. So, I apologize. The um, the text is asking us to try to see these distinctions. Do we really, are the things that society and the world is telling us to get to make us happy, is it really making us happy? Are we content? Is it actually, in fact, weighing us down? Um, the text is asking us to look at whether we're even aware of that process and pointing out that we're largely unaware, that we've been on kind of an autopilot for so long that we don't see it very clearly. So, this is the key to awakening. And this is why the awakening of faith draws all these distinctions between the enlightened mind and the mind in samsara. Um, so, what's the key to awakening? How do we actually, that's the first step. What's the actual key? And we're asked to see suffering. We're asked to see that when we feel unhappy, when we feel stressed, when we feel depressed, when we feel a sense of loss, when we feel despair, when we when we become depressed by loud train noises, when we see all of those things, right? We've all had these experiences. When we understand that the universal, this is the first step to awakening. These things are not unique to us. We share all of these things. All of us here tonight have felt that way at some point. Um, when we see that the intensity with which we feel them is not unique, we have that idea. Well, no one's ever felt this bad before. No one's ever been this sad before. No one knows what I'm going through. In fact, we all know what we're going through because we all share it. But we don't think that way. We think all the time we're trapped in this bubble of self-loathing and self-pity, and it's just me and we can't see beyond ourselves. So the next step in awakening is really seeing that if we are feeling these difficult emotions, everyone is feeling these difficult emotions. So awakening in this respect is universal. It's universal because we are trying to very keenly see that we are all united in feeling this way. We have the same experience. We've experienced all of these things. There's no difference between me and you. There's no difference between um, people here in our community and some community on the other side of the world. We all have the same feeling. There's no difference between someone who shares our political ideas and someone who has completely different political ideas. Everyone has the same emotions and pain. There's no difference between someone we label enemy and someone we label friend. We all share the same experience, but the labels and the short-sightedness get in the way. And awakening is seeing that more broadly. So there's a term in Sanskrit, dukkha sattva, and it refers to the first few moments after enlightenment. And it's in reference to the initial ideas or the initial thoughts that come to mind after enlightenment. So what are Buddhas truly enlightened to? And it's a type of clarity that shows us this connected or shared experience. And through that shared experience, we see things more clearly. So the Buddha's initial, my best analogy would be we're all drowning, but we're pushing each other under the water, gasping for air, thinking that we're getting ahead rather than working together. So this is what the Buddha see. And because they see that connection, they are moved to teach, they're moved to help. So their great compassion comes from seeing that connection. And when you really start to broaden the view, I think you get a sense of what Kukai was talking about when he says you can hear the preaching of Dharmakaya in the sound of the wind or the sound of a bird's call, which is everything is a call to awakening. The same bird that we hear singing and the other person here singing is the same call to awakening. So there's a shared experience. And in that sense, I think it's very beautiful. So these are some of the different ways we can understand, the text. Maybe this is here at Heinjoji, instead of the temple bell, we have the train bell, which is our moment of awakening. So we have to realize, everyone hears the sound of the train, but does everyone hear it as the sound of awakening, or do they hear it as the sound of annoyance? Right? But it's the same bell. So one mind, two teachings. Okay. So we'll go further down into the text. So I'll put that back up on screen. And the next question is, how can they be inferred? The answer is, all things are originally of the mind only. They in fact transcend thoughts. Nevertheless, the deluded mind in non-enlightenment gives rise to irrelevant thoughts and predicates the world of objects. This being the case, we define this mentality as a state of being destitute of wisdom, avidya, or ignorance. I like this translation, by the way, is destitute of wisdom, which is a little bit better than ignorance, but this is the original Sanskrit avidya. The essential nature of mind is immutable in that it does not give rise to any deluded thoughts and therefore is the very opposite of ignorance. Hence, it is spoken of as having the characteristic of the light of great wisdom. Okay, so we'll pause there and I'll try to give some a little bit more insight into what that means. So it says, while the mind is originally pure, it has this potential for ignorance. And this is, I think, one of the more puzzling aspects in Buddhist philosophy, but especially as it comes up in the awakening of faith. How can something be originally pure, yet suddenly not pure at the same time? And I'm going to try to use an analogy from chemistry to explain this. And forgive me in advance because it's been a number of years since I was in chemistry class, but when I was reflecting on this part of the text, this is what kind of came to mind. So in chemistry, you have stable and unstable atoms. So some atomic structures can hold themselves together, others can't. So their existence is very limited, right? There's very short duration that they can hold their structure. Some are very stable, while others exist very briefly. So they can't hold their chemical structure, or they have a chemical structure that looks for other chemical bonds to obtain their stability. And I think we are like these chemical structures. On our own, we're very unstable and we grasp constantly for stability, but we're trying to bind to the wrong chemical structure. We bind to things that themselves are unstable. So this is the basis of the Buddhist teaching. Everything that we grasp for in samsara is does not last. So we bind to something. Oh, finally I'll be stable, and then we find out that thing doesn't last. That we end up being unstable again. We're floating around, and we bind to something else. You know, oh, it's going to be the sports car. This is it. It's going to make me happy. Oh no, I've got to modify the sports car and put on different tires, and then we're not happy, and then we sell it. We get, oh, but this sports car will make me happy. So we go from thing to thing to thing. Um, the Bodhisattva, on the other hand, is looking to bind with sentient beings to make them stable. It's offering them a teaching that sort of their missing atomic structure that will make their chemical structure stable. And because it's so simple, we miss it, right? We've been bouncing around thinking it must be this very grand, complex thing that we're missing out on, and it's not. The Buddhist teaching is saying, the more simplistic form is the more stable, and that's true in chemistry too, right? Most of the more stable atomic structures are very simple. The more complex ones uh, tend to be less stable, if I remember my chemistry correctly. Um, but this is, what we're going through constantly. So although our chemical structure is originally pure, right? The awakening faith says the mind is originally pure. Yet instantly comes this avidya, this ignorance, this state of being destitute of wisdom. And I think it's very much this way. We're trying so hard to find our stable state that we're bouncing around trying to bind with everything. Those things don't work, and it causes us all kinds of agitation. So we become more and more and more unstable. But the key is something much simpler, but it's just very hard for us to see. It's very difficult. Okay. So we will go to the next paragraph, and then we'll be almost at the end for this evening. Let's see, where do we leave off? So there. When the mind is in motion. When the mind is in motion, stirred by ignorance, is characterized by illusions and defilements, outnumbering the sands of the Ganges River, such as lack of true cognition, absence of self-nature, impermanence, blisslessness, impurity, fever, anxiety, deterioration, mutation, and lack of freedom. By contrast to this, the essential nature of mind, however, is motionless. It is undisturbed by ignorance. Therefore, it can be inferred that it must have various pure and excellent qualities, outnumbering the sands of the Ganges River. But if the mind gives rise to irrelevant thoughts and further predicates the world of objects, it will continue to lack these qualities. All these numberless excellent qualities of the pure principle are none other than those of one mind, and there is nothing to be sought after anew by thought. Thus, that which is fully endowed with them is called the Dharmakaya when manifested, and the Tathagata Garbha when latent. Okay. I'll remember to bring the video back this time. So one of the reasons I use this chemistry analogy, hopefully with some success, hopefully that wasn't too confusing, is my favorite part of chemistry was always the chain reaction type things where the teacher would pour chemicals in, and you get a big puff of smoke, or something dramatic would happen. Um, and I think this is as dramatic as it is, as interesting as it is from a student perspective. Um, it's not very stable. So the things that were always very stable but kind of boring, of course, was something like carbon. And we're feverishly taking notes in the notebook with our pencils, and carbon's doing its job very diligently by being stable and boring. Um, but this is exactly what the text is telling us, that the mind in motion, our thoughts constantly agitated, is the problem. So when we conceptualize, when we speculate about what will bring us stability, we come up with all these different ideas, right? So we are a chemical experiment without a manual. We're trying to figure out what's going to bring me stability. I'm so agitated. I keep reacting with everything I come in contact with. There's an explosion. There's a puff of smoke. There's this big release of heat. All these things are happening. What's going to make me stable? And we're going about it wrong. So this is all these sort of wrong-headed ideas about what the right way is this avidya. It's this lack of wisdom. We don't have the insight yet. So we're grasping onto all kinds of things. And it this process perpetuates unabated until what? It's right there in the text. How do we stop it? I'll put that back up. When the mind is in motion. So when we slow down, right, our nature is to grasp and grab things and jump around and leap, and right, we rarely slow. When do we slow down? When do you slow down? I'll clarify. When do we slow down and invite clarity? Most of the time, we slow down and invite stupor, right? When you go home, um, you know, randomly call a friend or text someone and say, "How did you relax tonight?" And they'll say, "Oh, I watched a movie. Um, you know, I watched a sports game. Are there any sports right now? I'm not sure. They did something very active, and although the body might be stopped, the mind is engaged with the drama of this TV show or movie, or the high drama, high stakes of the sporting event. So they haven't actually slowed. They've just shifted the activity. Um, or, as is very common for my neighbor right now, I fight back with incense smoke, but he fights me back with some other type of smoke. So there is oftentimes a clouding, or we're putting the mind into a different state where we're dropping our senses, we're dulling our senses. So this is something different. It's something that we don't often do. We don't often relax and yet be fully aware. We feel. I, I I like to go hiking, and more now, you encounter people playing loud music on the trail as they're hiking, and it's very difficult to get away from. Um, you have to stop for 15, 20 minutes to let them go down the trail and try to get away from their music, and it seems more and more. So even when you're in nature, our tendency is not to slow down, not to stop. So when we do slow, we have to ask, are we slowing in a manner that's helpful, or is it actually detrimental? Um, are we creating new ill-conceived ideas? Are we led astray more when we think we're slowing, or are we bringing up pure and excellent qualities? So these are questions we have to ask about our slowing. So last last weekend we watched the movie, Thich Nhat Hanh movie, Walk With Me, and he has a very famous book, No Mud, No Lotus. The mud is necessary for growing the lotus. So if you haven't grown lotuses or seen them growing wild, which you won't see so much in North America, but they tend to grow in the not just the mud, but you'll get the prettiest lotuses in the worst water. So when I was living in China, let's just say the plumbing wasn't always the best, and so it would sometimes flow right out to ditches nearby. But they would have these beautiful lotuses growing out of them, um, and so they're growing out of some pretty smelly places. But one thing is true about that water is the water is still. So in order for the conditions to be right, in order for there to even be mud from which the lotus grows, the water has to be still. So we need to let the silt settle and allow that to accumulate. And then your lotus can grow. But for most of us, it's swirling around so much. We don't have quietist pursuits. And I think that's maybe more true in the West. I have a hard time thinking of something culturally that people, maybe knitting, quilting, are probably closest to our quietest pursuits. Canning food, if people do that anymore. But things that people do as a group, which just allows us quiet time, gardening. We don't often have a lot of that. A lot of what we celebrate as relaxation is actually more agitation. So we need to let that swirling cloud of silt settle so that the mud accumulates and the lotus has the seed can germinate, it can actually grow, and then can actually blossom out. So this is one of the great I think insights of the awakening of faith at this stage, that the mind is originally pure, but it probably has some level of discomfort with the state in which it finds itself. So it swirls around looking for stability and does so without guidance. And it gets very used to this very agitated state. I don't know what the half-life of the mind is, but eventually it settles down and then it can do the work. But we are very much this way. And from a spiritual perspective, part of this awakening is seeing that what we need to bind with are each other. This isn't something that's done in a vacuum or totally on your own or only for your own sake. It's by seeing your connection and making connections with others that you actually get stability. I think this is very true. Right now, a lot of people, I think Michelle Obama came out and said that she was having some low-grade depression because of the quarantine and sheltering in place. And the more we feel disconnected from others, the more a lot of these emotions come up. So the more we feel, the inability to connect as we once did, these things come up. And, as human beings, we need that connection. So again, reading between the lines, the Buddha never came right out and said, necessarily you need one another. Actually, that's not true. There is a sutta about monks who thought the best way was to go off by themselves and live alone, and he corrects them that pursuing this is completely on your own is the wrong way, is not the right way. So even more so, I think right now we have this difficulty in a world where, for our own sakes, we need to be distant. It doesn't mean that we don't need connection. So I'm sure we're all having Zoom fatigue, but the more we can make connections to the best of our ability, the better, because that's definitely part of this spiritual awakening and us slowing down and sort of finding our state of stillness, right? Letting the silt settle so that the mud can form and the lotus can bloom. Yes, thank you. Andrew found it immediately. So if you look in the chat window, we have a direct link. So I think sometimes referred to as the better way to live alone. So see, this is instant Dharma now when you have the internet. This is good. Okay. So I've assailed you with quite a bit of the awakening of faith. Are there any questions about what we covered this evening? Just time for me to take a sip of water. It's not shown all the time. Well, I say it's not a focus of a lot of artistic representations, but the Buddha was always attended, and usually Ananda, but at least someone else present, um, especially when he got older. And you'll often see this with historically with a lot of the more famous monks. You'll often see sometimes in art a painting, and there'll be a young attendant. And if you look historically, we probably misunderstand this role, almost like as if they had a servant. Actually, that person was generally destined to be a great teacher in their own right. And a lot of the training came from just seeing, watching the teacher and seeing them. So that very close connection and relationship was very important for their development. And a lot of things were communicated without words. You would just watch. So everyone that I know on the path has stories of them just watching their teacher. What did they do? Being physically close to them and in service to them was a tremendous amount of the education. So it was not a solo pursuit. It was not something they did alone in their room with a book. It was very much something that's done as a group. So part of the reason you have, well, in the era of COVID, it's a little different, right? We're a little bit more separate, but all your questions guide the lecture, the insights. So we're all benefiting from one another. So we do have a question. When Oh, actually, that's a very good question. Should you use meditation music, or is that not beneficial? So traditionally, they wouldn't have some device to play music on while you're meditating. So that wasn't generally part. Most music was part of liturgy. However, that has a meditative component. So there was, obviously we have bells and try not to mess up my microphone levels this time. It's a loud bell like the train did. So there is music in Buddhist practice. When it comes to sitting meditation practice, um, traditionally it's not done with music. However, um, I'll refer back to some of you know I took part. I think this is going to be published this month, so we can share it. We did a study, a medical study. So there were about 8 doctors involved, and we had roughly 60 patients. So these were chronic pain patients, and we did meditation for 8 weeks with those patients to see if they could decrease their pain medication and some of their symptoms. So they were all appropriately examined and vetted and were part of the study. A lot of people had trouble with meditation because they were very hypersensitive to their environment. And that came through a variety of traumas. So many people came to having chronic pain through psychological issues, physical issues, abuse, disease. It was quite varied how people got there. So I learned a lot from that study because I realized if people were coming to the cushion or their chair or wherever they decided to meditate from a very wide variety of backgrounds. And we had a lot of time to debrief what were their obstacles. So we did use music, and it was very helpful for people. So if you are going to use music, this is my recommendation. Um, you want something that does not have a cadence or rhythm. And I know that sounds odd, but anything with a set rhythm will be more agitating than relaxing. So if it's got 808 drums and a good beat, and you're likely to hear it in a at a nightclub, avoid that music. So you want to go for something more ethereal, quiet, or music that you don't know where it's going. So you don't want your mind to attach to the music, where you're like, oh, this is the next transition, and now comes the violin, and next, waiting for. So you don't want it to be that predictable. The way you're going to be using it is almost like white noise to either um, cancel out a distraction that you can't get away from, such as, if you have a roommate that's loud, or your room or apartment or house is on a busy street or next to train tracks. You'd want to try to find music of that sort. Um, it is, it can be helpful because for many people, just just being quiet for the first time can bring up a tremendous amount of emotion and fear, pain. I remember one woman who was in the study had so much uh, her pain caused such a degree of agitation that the moment the room was too quiet, she would just start shaking. And when it was quiet, the slightest cough or someone clearing their throat, a small thing dropping, it was so silent that it made her very nervous. It took her about 6 weeks to become comfortable. And so we did use music a few times, um, and it created just enough of a baseline kind of background sound that she was able to meditate very well. And after using that for a while, she didn't need it anymore. So these days, I would say we can use it prescriptively. This was true even for me when I was in college, lived in the dorm. It was not the ideal necessarily um, meditation space. And I used meditation music to drown out the popular music my dorm mates were playing. So it was very difficult when Um, well, who was popular then? I don't know. Britney Spears or something was playing down the hallway. um, and so that music would have a tendency to get into your thinking, and that would be the obstacle to just the initial sitting, because I didn't have control over the environment. And it was Michigan, so you couldn't really go outside year round. You just sit out in the snow and freeze. Um, so that's how I used it. But I would say, um, there's nothing wrong with that. You just again want to make sure it doesn't have a rhythm. Um, if they're vocals, maybe something very ethereal, light, um, not rhythmic music that's agitating. I don't know. Maybe nothing popular. Nothing you're likely to hear on the radio. Um, but again, it would be a background. Try to play it very lightly, low volume would be my recommendation. You're not trying to focus on the music. I would say you're using it um, to create an environment more so. Um, when you have more control, and I would say too, you don't want to become dependent where like the only way you can do meditation is with that music. But um, definitely that cohort of patients taught me there's a lot of, we're all coming to practice from a different perspective. And it can definitely be a hurdle to come into a space that's overly quiet. And then, also people with traumatic backgrounds, um, silence can be very ominous. So I think we all have to be very aware of our starting point, and be kind and gentle to yourself. Um, don't look at someone else's practice and make comparisons, or um, think, well, I have to do it this way or that way, and I can't do this or that. So that kind of rigidity is not useful. So if you have a headache and you need to take Tylenol, take Tylenol. if your if your throat is dry, drink water. Be kind to your body, and that goes also for your environment. I'm sitting, on a meditation cushion, but if that hurts your knees, use a chair. Don't put extra obstacles in front of yourself. So, there are other questions? That was a good question. Did I miss one of the questions? Oh, I did. I'm sorry. Ah, thank you, Andrew. And Arwen, thank you. I missed the other question. So, um, I think my best advice when it comes to when we're already in an agitated state, hopefully we can cultivate some level of calm in advance so that when we confront the agitated state, we have a foundation or reservoir of capacity to fall back on. Um, and again, that's going to be different for all of us. So I'll be, very honest. My One of my obstacles um, when I started practice was anger, and um, very funny enough, actually, my father called me this morning, and he was reminiscing about high school, and he brought up a story about high school, and I said, well, the reason, that happened was, I was not happy with circumstances of things at the time. And so we had a really good conversation, actually, just out of happenstance. So, very strong emotions at the time is probably the worst time to try to do practice. So, if someone's very upset, it's not the time to say, well, that's not very Buddhist of you or something like that. Um, Everyone can be upset. Everyone may lose their cool. You may have high emotions. One of the reasons that I think practice is good is to create a foundation so you know what it feels like to not be elevated. I mean, complete opposite sides. You have calm, and then you have like maybe super calm. And so now when you shift over to being elevated, you recognize that elevated state as being so different from your now new calm, peaceful state that, in my experience, you can catch yourself before it explodes. And each time you're able to do that, you get better at it, and to the point where it no longer, you don't get pushed to that far side. Um, and this is recognition in retrospect. At the time, I didn't recognize that was happening. I eventually encountered a situation where I should have been upset, or normally I would have been, or I would have reacted much more strongly. And I didn't. And I thought, oh, why? That's interesting. Like that should have made me upset. Um, and I'm not. Or my response was actually to laugh. And it wasn't laughing at the situation. I was like, oh, I didn't get upset. But it really needs to be done in advance. And I think that's one of the great benefits of practice is if we do get very elevated, there's a lot of making up to do for the situation. So the times that we do get angry and yell, or we lose our calm, or we say things we don't mean, we spend a lot of times fixing it. So the less we are agitated, then the less we have to apologize or fix. And the more we see that as a benefit to our life, the more we value our practice. But doing it at the time that we are upset is not the right time, especially directing towards others, telling them to calm down, usually makes people more upset. Um, when we feel that coming up, that's when we want to try to have awareness. Oh, here it comes. I'm about to feel upset. So the early days was, you become aware, oh, my face is hot. I'm about to become very angry. This is happening. And then you can kind of pull yourself back. Um, Over time, it becomes less. You have less of that response. It just doesn't come up. Because it's, from a Buddhist perspective, it's sort of um, a learned behavior. So you can unlearn it. You don't have to become upset at those things. You unlearn it. Hopefully that helps. Oh, another question. Oh, thanks. Thanks everybody for questions tonight. I appreciate this. Recommendations for bringing afflictive emotions onto the path. Oh, there are practices to work with difficult emotions. Um, I think the best kind of general advice is reflecting on those emotions when you're not in the middle of experiencing it. So, sit down and, as a meditation practice, reflect on a time when your emotions were very elevated, and, try to really think back. I won't use the words like relive, but try to think back through the stages of that very elevated response. And what you're looking for in that, usually the strong emotion is directed at or is attacking some aspect of our identity, right? Someone says, you're not very good at your job, or you're not as good at this as you think you are, or who do you think you are? They're attacking some identity perspective because we have in our mind we are good at our job or we are important, or and when we can let go of that identity, or we recognize, probably better to say, when we recognize that another person's opinion of us and the work we do, how we look, um, whatever it was that was attacked or we thought was attacked, when we recognize that the other person's perception is not the reality, we can start to let go of the emotional response. But in the moment, it's very difficult. Um, when I was in graduate school, one of my professors did not, she wanted the students to be afraid of her. And I had already had a career by that time. So I went to her office to ask for clarification on an assignment. And very quickly, it was her perception that um, I was not like, I don't know how to say it. I wasn't pious enough, or I wasn't, everybody else came in afraid and kind of, groveling. And I was very matter of fact. I'd like clarification on the assignment. Are you looking for this? You're looking that. She wanted more emotion. And having had a business career, I just didn't see that that had any part in the situation. Um, so we did not get off on the right foot, to say the least. Um, she didn't. I was different from the other students, and she didn't like that. Um, so I had emotions about that, and she had no emotions about that. And later, I realized she wasn't going to change, but I could. So I went back and was more expressive, and that healed the relationship. So I could have taken the position, uh, you know, what, why should I do that? Why does she deserve to have me change for her? But in the big scheme of things, it wasn't that important. I could recognize what she needed, and I got my needs met, and the relationship was healthy. So I was able to take a step back. So sometimes I think if we can have more reflection on where where the hurt is coming from. Now, one of my good friends went back with a totally different attitude and told her directly, "I'm not gonna, grovel or beg, and I'm paying for the tuition, and you should just give me the answer I'm asking for, and what's the point?" So that relationship was not good. um, that's not to say that she's right, but we have to assess and determine, um, what, how much time we want to put into things. So um, I think the more, just this last paragraph in the Awakening of Faith, the more we slow down, the more those things we become more aware of that process. And sometimes it's too late. Sometimes we are only aware of it right after it happens, right? we say something and we're like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. But that's still progress rather than, I'm sure we've all been in the situation where we say, this happened to me, and we're talking to a good friend of ours, and we start to get the impression that our friend doesn't agree with us, but they don't want to say it directly. And they're like, well, did you try this? Or did you think of that? And it's making us more mad. Um, so it's often the case that it's, we have a title, an ego, an idea of ourselves that we're protecting or are protective of. And when something comes up to challenge that, we we react. So that does take time because think about how old you are. You have had that many years to create this sense of self. And so anything attacking it is going to get a big response. So it's going to take time to soften that built up facade so that it can be more emotive. Now, that doesn't mean, I know someone's thinking it, that doesn't mean you just take abuse incessantly and, that's the Buddhist way. It doesn't mean that. Um, it does mean, being more objective. And then when you do need to assert yourself, you're able to, I think, be more effective or strategic about it, right? What's really going to get a response? What's really going to be of benefit? Or rather than just lashing back out. I hope that helped. Yes. Jamie's suggestion on de-escalation, just knowing your own triggers, that is very important to know. I, for many years, um, worked in a high stress environment where I had to, be across the table, asking people questions and negotiating. And I was immediately almost always attacked for um, appearing younger than the person thought I should be. So I would almost inevitably, are you even old enough to be here? What kind of credentials do you have to even ask me that question? And so it was an immediate attack on that. Um, and that didn't bother me. I thought, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm here, so let's just get on with it. But oftentimes people I worked with were really put off by that. Um, so definitely being aware of what might set you off is important. So if you go into a situation, just being very aware of yourself, that level of introspection, it does take time. It you know um, there's some introspective, and I will say, I I I have some very high pressure situations I've worked with directly with um, law enforcement, local, state, federal, international, high stakes stuff that I had done, and putting it in practice directly in very difficult situations is possible um, without walking away and being devastated by it. So that is possible. It does take practice, and I'm still practicing. So, are there any other questions? I really appreciate people asking questions. It's really good. This is a good way to connect rather than me just talk because there's no one else here right now, so I have to look at the screen. I appreciate everybody's input. No? Okay. So thank you all for joining me this evening. We will have a couple more events coming up That is the remembrance for the victims of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, happening on Saturday. So that'll be live streamed on Facebook. We will be celebrating Obon this weekend on Sunday, so we'll have video available for that. And then this class again next week, Thursday. And then, if I have the dates correct, the following weekend, we'll have our movie discussion. So please look for that notice if you can join us. It's a little less of me lecturing and more of us kind of talking and having a chance to watch a movie and talk about it. So that's been really a lot of fun. I've appreciated everybody's input. So if you could put your hands together and recite with me. Namo Daishi Henjo Kongo. Namo Daishi Henjo Kongo. Namo Daishi Henjo Kongo. Thank you, everyone, for taking time this evening and joining us. Please continue to stay healthy and safe. And I look forward to seeing you online next time. So have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you, Sensei.